You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this like ingrained expectation of precision. Feels almost like engineering, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's like you fall off your bike, your wrist swells up, and you go to the hospital.
Oh.
And the x-ray shows that jagged white line across the bone.
Right, and the doctor just points at that illuminated screen and says, well, there it is. Broken.
Exactly. It's a problem with a defined visible border.
Yeah.
And the solution is, equally mechanical.
Which provides this undeniable comfort, I think. We naturally gravitate toward things that can be categorized, right?
Yeah.
Things we can put in a neat little box and just address with a standardized protocol.
Yeah, totally.
A fractured radius is terrifying for a moment, but the protocol, like the cast, the rest, the physical therapy, it offers a very predictable map back to normalcy.
But then you step out of the orthopedic wing and into the world of, say, deep psychological trauma, or in the case of what we're exploring today, profound spiritual warfare. And suddenly, that crisp, reassuring x-ray machine is just completely useless.
It really is. You find yourself looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, largely invisible, and just deeply subjective.
Right. The affliction shifts from a fractured radius to like a fractured soul. And the conventional tools we rely on to navigate reality suddenly feel glaringly inadequate.
Yeah, and that is exactly where the tension lies in the material we are unpacking today.
Which brings us to our deep dive. We are exploring a highly specific, intense, and frankly fascinating worldview today with you all. We're looking at excerpts from a book titled God, SWAT-Warriors Part 1 by Ray Engelbrecht.
It's quite a title.
It really is. And as we start laying out the architecture of this author's universe, I want to set a clear parameter for you, the listener. We are stepping into this text as your impartial guides.
Right.
Whether you share this specific theology or whether you come from a totally different faith tradition entirely, or even if you just view this purely through the lens of like religious sociology, our goal is to objectively map out the author's paradigm.
Exactly. We are going to explore the mechanics of this intricate spiritual warfare framework so you can fully understand the machinery operating behind his words.
So, to start us off, what is the overarching architecture here?
Well, the text introduces a concept that completely redefines the daily life of a modern believer. The author argues that believers shouldn't be operating as, casual observers or passive Sunday attendees.
Right, just sitting in the pews.
Yeah. Instead, he says they should operate as a highly trained, metaphorical, spiritual SWAT team.
Wow.
And from that initial premise, the text expands into this massive strategy of waging a cosmic war across 3 distinct domains: land, sea, and air.
That's a huge scale.
It is. And then it zooms back in to identify the specific, non-negotiable warrior traits required to actually execute this mission: bravery, toughness, and zeal.
Well, let's start with that title, because God's SWAT-Warriors is an incredibly provocative hook. I mean, we all have a cinematic understanding of what a police SWAT team is, right?
Oh, for sure. You picture the black tactical gear.
Exactly. The armored vehicles, the battering rams taking a door off its hinges at 3 a.m. But applying a modern militarized law enforcement acronym to Christian spirituality feels, a bit jarring. How does the author bridge that gap?
The text is actually meticulous in defining this metaphor early on, specifically so the reader doesn't get lost in that Hollywood imagery.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, the author explicitly states that in this context, the term SWAT, standing for Specialized Weapons and Tactics, is not some newly discovered biblical office. You won't flip to the book of Ephesians and find the word SWAT in the original Greek.
Right.
Instead, he uses it as a metaphorical framework to describe a highly specific spiritual posture and really a level of maturity.
Okay, so if a standard police officer is patrolling a neighborhood, making sure the speed limits are obeyed, what is the spiritual equivalent of the SWAT unit actually being called in?
Well, in law enforcement, a patrol officer is equipped for standard day-to-day community maintenance.
Yep.
But when a situation escalates beyond their capacity, like a complex hostage crisis, a barricade, a bomb threat, the specialized unit is deployed. Engelbrecht maps this directly onto the spiritual realm.
Interesting.
His SWAT team describes a subset of believers who are exceptionally grounded, accountable, and specially trained to handle intense spiritual crises that standard pastoral care might just not resolve.
Like what kind of crises?
The text points to scenarios involving deep generational oppression, complex psychological bondages, and the necessity for intense deliverance.
I'm trying to visualize the demographic of this group.
Yep.
Because when you introduce the concept of a spiritual SWAT team, human nature almost guarantees that some people will see that as an invitation to form this exclusive, hyper-aggressive club.
Oh, the super Christians.
Exactly, the kind of people who think they are spiritually superior to the rest of the congregation.
Yeah, and the text actually anticipates that exact sociological hazard. The author draws a very hard line here, emphasizing what this SWAT team is fundamentally not.
Okay, what is it not?
It is absolutely not an elite, secretive, or self-appointed vanguard. He critiques the modern phenomenon where people become driven by hype, fear, or a sensationalized, almost cinematic obsession with hunting demons.
Right, like their reality show version of exorcism.
Precisely. That's the opposite of what he advocates. The author stresses that true spiritual authority on this metaphorical SWAT team flows exclusively from submission and accountability.
So no lone wolves.
Exactly. If a believer attempts to enter this level of spiritual combat out of ego, a desire for recognition, or an urge to look powerful on a stage, they are instantly disqualified.
Wow.
Yeah, the authority required to dismantle a spiritual barricade, according to the text, cannot coexist with pride. It requires a posture of profound humility and submission to the will of God.
That sets up a really fascinating psychological profile. Because if the operative isn't driven by ego or the thrill of the fight, what is their core motivation?
Well, the author illustrates this by drawing a rigid binary between a soldier and a warrior.
Wait, a soldier and a warrior. In everyday conversation, we use those words completely interchangeably.
We do, but in this text, they represent entirely opposing worldviews. It's a foundational paradigm shift for the reader. The text asserts that God is not recruiting soldiers. He is looking exclusively for warriors.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that binary. What makes someone a soldier in this framework?
According to the text, a soldier fights merely to live. They fight to obey a direct order, and their engagement is often transactional.
Transactional in what way?
A soldier is essentially described as a hireling working for a paycheck. They step onto the battlefield because it is their assigned job, but their ultimate loyalty is to their own survival and their own personal gain.
Which means the moment the risk outweighs the compensation, the soldier just abandons a post.
Exactly.
While the warrior, on the other hand...
The warrior, the text argues, lives to fight. The warrior fights for honor, for justice, and operates out of a deeply ingrained duty to rescue others.
Oh, that's a big difference.
Yeah, the author uses the biblical analogy from the Gospel of John, contrasting the shepherd with the hired hand. When the wolf attacks the flock, the hired hand, the soldier, runs away because the sheep don't belong to him. His survival instinct trumps his duty.
Right, whereas the shepherd,
who represents the warrior, lays down his life to protect the flock because his connection to them is relational, not transactional.
that brings to mind the difference between, like, a private military contractor and a parent protecting a child.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Because the mercenary is entirely transactional. They calculate the risk, look at their contract, and determine if the fight is worth the paycheck. But a parent doesn't run a cost-benefit analysis when their child is in danger.
Right.
They don't, check their bank account before stepping in front of a threat. They act out of a pure sacrificial devotion.
That is an incredibly accurate secular translation of the spiritual dynamic the author is conveying. The SWAT warrior in this book is not looking for a spiritual promotion. They are motivated by an agonizing awareness of the affliction of others and a sacrificial necessity to see those captives set free.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, though, because language shapes behavior.
Sure.
If someone adopts a warrior mindset and they internalize this intense, combative posture, doesn't that risk bleeding over into how they treat people?
How do you mean?
Like, you see someone struggling with an addiction or a toxic behavioral pattern, and instead of offering empathy, you go into full tactical assault mode. Doesn't this militarized language inherently breed hostility toward the very people you are supposed to be helping?
That is honestly the most common critique when applying military metaphors to any religious framework, and the author explicitly addresses the target of this aggression to prevent that exact outcome.
Oh, he does.
Yes. The hostility is never, under any circumstances, directed at human beings.
So the warrior doesn't view the difficult neighbor or the antagonistic family member as the enemy.
Not at all. The text leans heavily on the Apostle Paul's doctrine in Ephesians 6, which states that the battle is not against flesh and blood. The warrior's aggression, their defiance, and their combative energy are directed entirely at the invisible spiritual strongholds of darkness, injustice, and deception.
Okay, I see.
In this paradigm, the human being is always the hostage, never the combatant. The SWAT team's aggression is focused purely on the invisible chains holding the person captive.
So the hostility is reserved exclusively for the illness, never the patient. If you're a surgeon, you attack the tumor with incredible aggression, but your entire goal is the preservation of the patient.
A perfect parallel. The warrior is uncompromisingly aggressive against suffering and bondage precisely because they love the person trapped beneath it.
Okay, so we've established the psychological and spiritual profile of this operative. We have a humble, submitted warrior, motivated by sacrificial love, aiming their hostility purely at invisible oppressors. If this is a specialized tactical unit, what exactly is the arsenal? Because obviously a spiritual SWAT team isn't using physical flashbangs or sniper rifles.
Well, the author emphasizes that before a single weapon is deployed, the overarching principle must be strategic intelligence. He critiques a very common phenomenon in modern spiritual circles, where people attempt to engage in warfare just by, as he puts it, shouting and screaming at the devil, hoping sheer volume will take back territory.
Oh, right. It's the equivalent of walking into a dark room and just firing a machine gun in every direction, hoping you hit something hostile.
Which is reckless and ultimately ineffective. The author draws a direct comparison to conventional military tactics. The U.S. military does not authorize an airstrike by throwing darts at a map.
No, definitely not.
A kinetic strike is the final step in a massive chain of counterintelligence, satellite surveillance, and strategic planning. In the spiritual realm, the text argues, a SWAT team relies heavily on God's wisdom and discernment to know how, when, and where to operate.
They need to gather intel.
Exactly. They need to understand the enemy's specific tactics and identify any legal spiritual doorways that have been opened. Operating in ignorance on this battlefield is considered highly dangerous.
So, assuming the intelligence has been gathered and the target is acquired, the text outlines the actual weapons. And looking at the source material, these weapons are highly unconventional. I mean, they completely defy any logical military strategy.
Oh, they require a total inversion of human logic. The first major weapon the text highlights is praise.
Singing is a tactical assault.
It sounds absurd until you look at the biblical case study the author provides. He points to the Old Testament story of King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles.
Okay, what happens there?
Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, receives intelligence that a massive, overwhelming coalition of enemy armies, the Moabites and Ammonites, is marching to annihilate his kingdom.
Wow.
Now, conventional military doctrine dictates that you immediately draft every able-bodied citizen, fortify your walls, ration your food, and prepare for a brutal, bloody defense.
You sharpen every sword you have.
Right. But the text says God gives him a completely different battle plan. A prophet tells Jehoshaphat, "You will not have to fight this battle. The battle is not yours, but God's."
Okay, so what does he do?
In response, Jehoshaphat makes a tactical decision that baffles the natural mind. He appoints a choir. He sends singers out to the very front lines of the march, ahead of the armed infantry, to sing praises to God.
I am trying to visualize the psychology of this moment from the perspective of the enemy army.
Yeah.
Like, you are massed for a slaughter, you're looking across the valley at the people you are about to conquer, and instead of a shield wall, a group of unarmed people steps forward and starts singing.
Right.
It must have induced pure psychological chaos. I mean, if you're at West Point, they don't teach you to send the choir to the front lines. It makes zero logical sense.
It completely violates all conventional military doctrine, but that's the author's whole point. The text asserts that this praise acted as the spark plug of faith.
The spark plug of faith.
Yeah, as the choir sang, the narrative states that the enemy armies fell into total confusion, turned their weapons on each other, and essentially annihilated themselves before Jehoshaphat's army ever swung a sword. The author uses this to illustrate a core mechanic of this warfare. God demands a higher level of trust in supernatural methods over human logic.
The mechanism here is so fascinating. You don't fight to eventually achieve a victory. You praise because you believe the victory is already structurally secured. And that act of praise alters the spiritual atmospheric pressure, causing the enemy's infrastructure to collapse.
The author genuinely believes praise actively jams the enemy's frequencies, and this leads to the second unconventional weapon, which operates on a similar principle of transferred authority: prayer.
Right, okay.
The text references the story of Moses in Exodus 17 during a battle against the Amalekites.
This is one of the strangest tactical setups in ancient history. You have Joshua down in the valley leading the troops, engaging in the actual kinetic, physical combat, swords, shields, hand-to-hand warfare.
No.
But the author focuses on Moses, who is standing on a hill miles away overlooking the valley.
And the text highlights that the outcome of the physical bloodshed in the valley is entirely governed by what Moses is doing on that hill. When Moses holds his hands up in prayer and supplication to God, Joshua's forces miraculously surge and win the upper hand. But when Moses, who is an elderly man, experiences muscle fatigue and his arms drop, the Amalekites immediately start slaughtering the Israelites.
It violates all laws of physics. The velocity and impact of Joshua's sword swing in the valley are entirely dependent on the lactic acid buildup in Moses' shoulders on a distant hill.
It really is wild when you think about it.
The text says it got so bad that Aaron and Hur had to physically drag a rock over for Moses to sit on. And they stood on either side of him, physically holding his arms up toward the sky until the sun went down.
The author's thesis here is that the true power source dictating the outcome of earthly events is not the physical weaponry. It is the spiritual authority accessed through unceasing, agonizing prayer.
So prayer isn't just asking nicely.
No, prayer in this framework is not a passive request line to heaven where you leave a voicemail and hope for the best. It is an active, offensive weapon that alters the reality of the physical battlefield.
Wow.
Furthermore, the inclusion of Aaron and Hur illustrates the necessity of the team aspect of the SWAT unit. You cannot sustain this level of spiritual warfare in isolation. You require a squad to hold up your arms when human endurance fails.
If you, the listener, are trying to map this out, we have unconventional weapons like praise and intercessory prayer, and we have intelligence gathering. But where is this arsenal actually being deployed?
That is a big question.
If I am a SWAT warrior holding an invisible weapon, I need to know the coordinates of the front line. And the author builds out a massive, highly detailed topography of this war.
He does. He scales the battlefield from the macro, the vast cosmic domains, all the way down to the microscopic territory of the individual human mind. Let's look at the macro first. The text asserts that demonic forces, fallen angels who rebelled against God, occupy three specific realms of earthly creation: the land, the sea, and the air.
Land, sea, and air. The traditional triad of global military dominance.
Yes. And the author draws a brilliant historical parallel to illustrate why the enemy operates in these three spheres. He essentially argues that spiritual supremacy mirrors earthly military supremacy throughout human history.
How so?
The empires that managed to dominate the globe did so precisely because they achieved absolute mastery over one or more of these domains.
The text mentions the Vikings, which is a great example.
Oh, absolutely.
The Vikings were terrifying land invaders, but their supremacy was derived entirely from their mastery of the sea. Their shallow draft longships allowed them to strike deep inland without warning and just vanish before a defense could be mounted.
The author also points to Napoleon Bonaparte, whose genius in organizing massive army corps and artillery fundamentally revolutionized land combat, allowing him to conquer Europe. And then he brings the analogy into the 20th century, pointing to the German Luftwaffe. The near-total subjugation of Europe in the early years of World War II was driven almost entirely by Germany's mastery of the air through blitzkrieg tactics.
So he's linking all of this.
Yes. The author's underlying logic is that just as earthly geopolitical war requires conquering land, sea, and air, the invisible spiritual war requires the believer to engage and dismantle demonic hierarchies operating in these exact same three realms.
Let's break down the author's theology of these three domains, starting with the air. If an earthly military uses the sky to drop bombs or intercept communications, what is the spiritual equivalent?
The text anchors this in the Apostle Paul's description in Ephesians 2, which refers to Satan as the prince of the power of the air. In this architecture, there is a demonic host existing in the heavenly sphere, the atmosphere immediately surrounding the earth.
And what are they doing up there?
Their objective is to blanket regions, dominate the overarching systems of the world, and act as a spiritual blockade. The author references Revelation 18, describing fallen Babylon as a cage for every unclean and hated bird.
Okay, a cage.
He interprets this imagery as a metaphor for foul spirits operating in the aerial realm, seeking to corrupt the overarching culture and cut off divine communication.
It's like a signal jamming operation. If they control the airwaves, they control the narrative of the culture below.
Exactly.
What about the water? Because this section of the text felt deeply ancient, almost mythological.
The author's focus on water spirits is very pronounced. He references massive, ancient sea creatures mentioned in the Psalms and Isaiah, specifically Leviathan and Rahab.
Now, to a modern reader, Leviathan just sounds like a mythical sea monster, like a giant squid or a prehistoric whale.
But the author does not view these as poetic metaphors for chaotic oceans. In his theological framework, these are ancient, highly ranked demonic entities representing the spiritual power source behind oppressive earthly empires.
So they're literal entities.
Yes, and the text specifically links the entity Rahab to the geopolitical power of ancient Egypt. The author paints a very dark, vivid picture here. He suggests that when Pharaoh went out to the Nile River every morning, which we see in the book of Exodus, he wasn't just taking a royal morning stroll.
What was it doing?
He was holding a diplomatic meeting. He was fellowshipping with and drawing power from these localized occult water spirits. By covenanting with the entities of the Nile, Pharaoh imbibed their cruel, tyrannical character, which he then unleashed on the enslaved Israelites.
Wow. That completely reframes the entire Exodus narrative. So the plagues turning the Nile to blood and eventually the parting of the Red Sea, they weren't just spectacular magic tricks to secure a physical escape route.
No, not in this view.
They were acts of cosmic warfare.
Yeah.
God was systematically demonstrating ultimate supremacy over the demonic realm of the water that the Egyptian empire worshipped and relied on.
Exactly. The physical liberation was the result of a spiritual victory over the sea domain. And finally, we have the land or the earth. This introduces the strategic concept of territorial spirits.
So these are entities that want to plant a flag in the dirt.
They seek geographic occupation. The text argues that these forces aren't just floating abstractly. They want to control physical, localized territory, a specific home, a neighborhood, a city, or an entire nation.
Why do they want territory?
The author's premise is that if a demonic force can achieve spiritual control over a geographic area, they secure a legal right to influence, oppress, and shape the minds and culture of the human beings living on that land.
This scope is dizzying. We're talking about principalities blanketing the atmosphere, ancient entities holding court in the oceans, and territorial spirits laying claim to our cities.
It's massive.
And the text even projects that this multi-domain war will ultimately converge in a massive physical battle at the end of human history.
Yes, the Battle of Armageddon. This is where the text claims the spiritual and the physical will completely intersect. Armageddon translates from the Hebrew Harmageddon, meaning Mount Megiddo.
Which is a real place.
It's a real geographic plain in Israel. The author points out the profound historical irony of this location. It has seen countless earthly battles over millennia, from the ancient Egyptians and Assyrians to Napoleon and even World War I.
Wow.
The text argues that the invisible spiritual war across the land, sea, and air will eventually spill over into a final, catastrophic, visible conflict in this exact geographic basin.
If I am listening to this, I have to admit, it feels entirely paralyzing.
Oh, completely.
Like, if the enemy controls the atmospheric broadcast and ancient entities rule the oceans, what on earth am I supposed to do about it on a Tuesday morning while I'm commuting to work? I am one person. How do I engage in a war on a cosmic scale?
That is the most vital pivot the author makes in the text. He doesn't leave the reader staring helplessly at the sky. He takes this macro, terrifyingly vast battlefield and shrinks it down to the micro level.
The macro level.
And he reveals that the ultimate prize in this cosmic war isn't actually a piece of dirt in the Middle East or a cloud formation over the Atlantic. The ultimate prize, the absolute center of gravity in this war, is the human being.
The microcosm of the cosmos.
The author explains that the three external domains, land, sea, and air, are perfectly mirrored by three internal fronts of human attack: the world, the flesh, and the devil.
The unholy trinity of temptation.
And these three fronts are specifically deployed to target and conquer the dominion of the individual human, which the author also divides into a trinity: the spirit, the soul, and the body.
Okay, let's slow down and really map this out, because this is the architecture of the human experience according to the text. We understand the body. That's the physical vessel.
Right.
And the spirit is the part of us that connects with the divine. But the author gets incredibly specific about the middle territory, the soul.
The author refuses to let the soul be some ethereal, ghost-like concept. He subdivides the soul into three functional, highly practical parts: the mind, the heart, and the will.
So our cognitive thoughts, our emotional center, and our decision-making capacity.
Exactly. And this is the primary battlefield. The goal of all this cosmic activity, the entire reason the enemy operates in the air, land, and sea, is to eventually establish what the Apostle Paul calls strongholds within the mind, heart, and will of the individual.
I want to spend some time on that word, stronghold.
Yeah.
Because in a highly spiritualized context, our minds immediately jump to horror movies.
Oh, yeah, full-blown supernatural possession.
Right. Levitating beds, head spinning. But the author's definition of a spiritual stronghold is vastly more insidious and honestly much more common.
The text strips away the cinematic horror and defines strongholds as false perceptions, toxic upbringings, unhealed traumas, and deeply ingrained bad habits that fundamentally alter our reality. A stronghold is a fortress of lies constructed over time within the human mind.
So if someone experiences a severe childhood trauma, and as a coping mechanism, they develop a deep subconscious belief that, say, no one can be trusted and everyone will eventually abandon me.
Yeah.
The author's saying that isn't just a psychological defense mechanism, that false perception is a brick-and-mortar fortress where a territorial spirit of fear or isolation has actually taken up residence within their soul.
That is precisely the author's framework. The trauma is the doorway, the resulting false perception is the stronghold, and the spiritual entity is the occupier. And this is where the text offers a very sharp, highly controversial critique of how modern society attempts to solve these problems.
Right, because if I go to a secular therapist with that issue, they're going to help me trace that belief back to my childhood, help me recognize my triggers, and give me cognitive behavioral tools to slowly rewire my brain. But the author argues that secular psychology is insufficient.
He argues that the modern church has largely abdicated its mandate for spiritual warfare, outsourcing the healing of the soul entirely to secular psychology, sociology, and anthropology. The text claims these disciplines have replaced the Word of God in many institutions.
I can hear a lot of listeners pushing back hard on that. I mean, therapy saves lives. Understanding the neuroscience of the amygdala and how the brain processes trauma is scientifically proven to help people function.
Oh, absolutely. And the author doesn't deny the reality of the psychological pain, nor does he necessarily deny the biological function of the brain. But his argument is one of symptom versus root cause.
How so?
He argues that addressing the mind through human logic and behavioral adjustments without addressing the spirit is like taking pain medication for a bullet wound without actually extracting the bullet.
Wow, okay.
The author believes that human wisdom, no matter how advanced, simply cannot reach the depths of spiritual occupation. He argues that true, lasting deliverance, the actual dismantling of the stronghold, requires the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit to unlock the complex, intertwined nature of human trauma. In his view, the Holy Spirit is the ultimate diagnostician and surgeon of the soul.
It is a paradigm that demands absolute reliance on the supernatural. It's telling the reader, your crippling anxiety isn't just a chemical imbalance in your hardware, it is a spiritual virus in your software. And it requires a supernatural IT department to purge it.
That captures the essence of the text's assertion perfectly.
Okay, if we accept this premise, for the sake of the deep dive, that we are engaged in an intense psychological and cosmic war over the very territory of our minds and hearts, it requires a highly specific type of person to step onto that battlefield.
It really does.
You can't just send anyone into that kind of meat grinder without preparation.
Which brings us to the 3 vital traits of the SWAT warrior outlined in the text. Let's explore trait number 1, bravery.
Bravery is the absolute prerequisite. The author is very sober about the state of the world, comparing our current age to the days of Noah, an era of profound darkness, cruelty, and moral depravity.
He paints a grim picture.
He does. He argues that simply standing up and articulating the truth in such a climate requires an immense reservoir of courage. He talks about the necessity of having a different spirit and points directly to the Old Testament figure of Caleb.
Caleb is the archetype of this bravery. When Moses sent 12 spies into the Promised Land to scout the territory, they all saw the exact same data. They all saw the fortified cities, and they all saw the massive giants occupying the land.
And what happened?
10 of the spies came back utterly terrified. They allowed the external reality to dictate their internal identity, stating, "We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes."
They had the physical facts, but they lacked the spiritual truth.
Exactly. But Caleb and Joshua had a different spirit. They didn't deny the existence of the giants, but they refused to bow to the fear of them because they believed the promise of God was infinitely larger than the physical threat. They possessed a bravery that was untethered from their physical circumstances.
The author anchors this specific type of bravery in 2 Timothy 1.7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. This isn't the kind of bravery you manufacture by gritting your teeth, listening to a hype song, and psyching yourself up. It is an imparted bravery.
And he uses the ultimate underdog story to drive this home. David versus Goliath.
I love the text analysis of this because David is the complete antithesis of the conventional trained soldier we discussed earlier.
David had zero formal military training. When King Saul tried to dress him in standard bronze armor, David couldn't even walk. He was a shepherd boy carrying a sling.
Right.
But his bravery completely baffled the professional, paralyzed soldiers shivering in the trenches. Why? Because David's bravery wasn't rooted in his own combat proficiency. It was rooted entirely in his perception of the greatness of God, built during his time fighting lions and bears in secret to protect his sheep.
So how did he see Goliath?
He looked at a 9-foot, heavily armored, undefeated giant and essentially concluded he is defying the living God. He's too big to miss.
It's a bravery born entirely of perspective. If your God is small, the giant is terrifying. If your God is supreme, the giant is just an obstacle in the way of a testimony.
That shift in perspective is what gets the SWAT warrior onto the battlefield. But initial adrenaline and bravery will only take you so far. Which leads us to the second vital trait, toughness.
Toughness.
Because bravery opens the door, but toughness is what keeps you in the room when the enemy starts firing back.
How does the author distinguish toughness from bravery?
Toughness, in this framework, is endurance. It is the capacity to absorb hardship, persecution, and pain without surrendering, retreating, or compromising the mission. The primary biblical case study the author uses here is from the book of Acts, focusing on the early apostles, Peter and John.
What happens to them that requires this level of toughness?
They are brought before the Sanhedrin, the ultimate religious and political authority of their day, for the crime of healing a lame man and preaching the name of Jesus. The authorities explicitly threaten them, legally command them to cease their activities, and then physically flog them.
So they're beaten.
They are essentially tortured to send a message.
And the response to being beaten by the Supreme Court of their nation is the absolute definition of toughness.
The text notes that immediately after being flogged and threatened with worse consequences, they didn't go into hiding. They didn't convene a committee to discuss how to soften their message to avoid future beatings.
They didn't retreat at all.
No, they walked straight out of the trial and went directly back to the temple courts, the most public, heavily surveilled place possible, and continued teaching exactly what they had just been beaten for. The author distills this with the phrase, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going." They possess the stamina to absorb the blow and double down on the truth.
I want to contextualize this for the modern listener, because most people listening to this deep dive, depending on where they live in the world, are probably not facing literal physical flogging from the government for their beliefs.
Right, of course.
The author acknowledges this, but he brings up a very potent, arguably more insidious modern application. The storms threatening believers today aren't always physical whips.
They are often much more subtle, which the text argues can make them far more dangerous to the soul.
The author lists the demands of modern life, the rapid shifting of social norms around family and marriage, and the constant suffocating pressure to compromise moral standards just to participate in society.
Yeah.
So let me pose this to you, the listener. What does toughness actually look like in the face of subtle social pressure versus overt physical persecution? It is one thing to stand your ground when an enemy is clearly defined, holding a sword to your chest. It feels heroic.
It does.
It is an entirely different kind of toughness to stand firm when the enemy is a slow, creeping cultural consensus that quietly tells you your values are outdated, bigoted, or simply irrelevant.
And the author would argue that succumbing to that slow drift of cultural compromise is the ultimate failure of toughness. The subtle daily pressure to dilute the truth, to remain silent in a conversation so you don't offend anyone, or to actively adapt historic theology to fit modern sociology so you can maintain social standing. That is the modern flogging.
Wow, the modern flogging.
Toughness, in the context of this text, is the intellectual and spiritual stamina to remain anchored to the unchanging Word of God, even when it guarantees you will become culturally unpopular, socially isolated, or professionally marginalized.
It is the endurance required to survive the profound discomfort of not fitting in. But as vital as bravery and toughness are, they are essentially defensive postures. They allow you to absorb a hit and hold your ground.
Sure.
But a SWAT team isn't deployed just to hold a perimeter. They are deployed to breach the door and rescue the hostage. And to move forward into hostile territory, the author says you need the third trait, zeal.
Zeal is the engine of the SWAT warrior. It is the absolute antidote to lukewarmness. The text unpacks the Greek word for zeal, zelos.
Zelos. What does it mean exactly?
It doesn't just mean a passing interest. It means to have a burning ardor or fervor of spirit. It is an intense, consuming eagerness to embrace, pursue, and defend the truth. It is unapologetic passion.
And this is where the author delivers his sharpest, most uncomfortable critique of the modern religious landscape. He compares the modern church to the church of Laodicea found in the book of Revelation.
The infamous lukewarm church. The historical context of Laodicea is vital here. The city had no natural water supply. It piped in hot water from nearby hot springs and cold water from the mountains.
Right.
By the time the water reached the city, it was tepid, lukewarm, and literally made people nauseous to drink. The text uses this physical reality as a metaphor for modern religious institutions that have lost their fire. The author argues that many churches have become fixated on wealth accumulation, self-upliftment, and creating a comfortable, polite, frictionless religious experience.
They want a religion that demands nothing and validates everything.
Exactly. The author references the scriptural indictment of Laodicea. This type of church thinks it is rich, wealthy, and in need of nothing. But the spiritual reality, the X-ray of their soul, reveals that they are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. They have completely lost their zeal.
It's a devastating indictment. He is essentially saying that a church focused solely on self-help seminars and personal prosperity has deserted the cosmic war. They have gone AWOL in the middle of a hostage crisis.
Because they lack the zeal required to act when it is inconvenient. Zeal is what compels action regardless of the cost. The author highlights historical figures whose zeal altered history.
Who does he mention?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who possessed such zeal for God that they refused to bow to a golden state-mandated idol, even while staring into the flames of a blazing execution furnace. Daniel, who continued to pray openly by his window, knowing with absolute certainty it would result in him being thrown into a den of starved lions.
And Martin Luther.
A perfect example. Luther challenged a corrupt, 1,000-year-old religious empire entirely because his zeal for the uncompromised truth of Scripture outweighed his very natural fear of being burned at the stake as a heretic.
The author introduces an ancient Hebrew battle cry here that I think perfectly encapsulates this entire mindset. Rak Chazak Amatz.
It translates roughly to the command given to Joshua. Be audaciously strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you.
I love the inclusion of the word audaciously. It implies a boldness that borders on the offensive.
Right.
It isn't a polite, quiet, timid strength. It is a loud, confident, relentless submission to the mission. It is the refusal to accept the status quo of a broken world. That is the SWAT mindset distilled into 3 words.
It is the internal fire that makes compromise impossible. The text argues that the enemy's primary tactic against the church isn't to destroy it outright, but to make it lose its intensity.
Make it lukewarm.
Exactly, to lull believers into passivity, to convince them to adopt a live and let live theology that quietly leaves the captives in their chains. Zeal is the refusal to let the hostage die.
So let's look at the culmination of all this. We have an army of believers mobilized as a highly trained, deeply humble SWAT unit. We understand the vast, multidimensional battlefield of land, sea, and air that is ultimately aiming to build strongholds in the human mind and heart.
We do.
We are equipped with the intelligence of heaven, the weapons of praise and prayer, the bravery to enter the fight, the toughness to absorb the cultural beatings, and the audacious zeal to push forward. What is the ultimate objective? When the door is finally breached, what is the SWAT team actually to pray to do?
This brings us to the final critical section of our deep dive, the mission objective. And the text clarifies a massive misconception right out of the gate.
What's the misconception?
The acts of deliverance and healing are not reserved for a few elite specialists who have a specific title on their office door.
Oh, so it's not just the celebrity pastors or the niche deliverance ministers who are authorized to do this work.
Not at all. The author points directly to the Great Commission and the explicit commands of Jesus in Luke 9 and Mark 16. The mandate to heal the sick, to cast out demonic forces, and to preach the gospel is given to every single disciple. It is the basic entry-level job description of anyone who claims to follow Christ.
The objective is complete and total restoration. And there is a specific, robust Greek word the author leans on heavily to describe this objective.
Sozo.
Sozo is a massive concept that appears over 100 times in the New Testament texts.
And it generally translates to the word saved, right? But the author expands on the modern Western definition of that word significantly.
Yeah, in modern religious vernacular, telling someone they are saved usually just implies that they have secured a metaphysical ticket to heaven after their physical body dies.
Like an escape hatch.
Exactly. It is viewed as an escape hatch from hell, a future tense transaction. But the text explains that the biblical concept of sozo is vastly more comprehensive. It means to save, yes, but it equally means to deliver, to make whole, to protect, to preserve, and to heal physically and mentally.
It is not just a promise for the afterlife. It is an active present reality for Tuesday morning.
The author emphasizes that God's intention is not just for disembodied spirits to eventually go to heaven, but for us to experience complete holistic prosperity in our spirit, our soul, and our body right here on earth.
Right.
Sozo is a life liberated from spiritual bondage, free from mental torment, and healed from emotional and physical disorders. The entire objective of the SWAT-Warrior is to bring the reality of sozo to the hostages trapped in darkness.
And to achieve that liberation, you have to tear down the infrastructure of the oppressor. The author uses a brilliant piece of wordplay here. He says, we aren't called to raise hell, as in causing trouble, partying, or living chaotically. We are called to raise hell, spelled R-A-Z-E.
To completely demolish it, to level it to the foundations.
Exactly. It creates a profound shift in how the reader views their daily interactions. The text argues that every time you share the truth of the gospel, every time you lay hands on someone and pray for their healing, every time you help someone recognize a lie they've believed about their self-worth, you are actively engaging in cosmic spiritual warfare.
You are.
You are encroaching on enemy-held territory, liberating a captive, and razor-lazing the kingdom of darkness brick by brick. Sharing the truth is not just an educational or theological exercise. It is an act of violent cosmic defiance against an empire of lies. But doing this requires an immense amount of power. You cannot breach a spiritual stronghold built by ancient entities using human willpower or secular psychology.
No, you can't.
Which is why the author stresses the vital concept of dunamis. It is another Greek word, meaning dynamic, miraculous, explosive power. It is the root of our English word dynamite. This power cannot be generated by human effort, education, or good intentions. It is supplied exclusively by the Holy Spirit.
And the ultimate protection, the bulletproof vest, the ultimate legal authority for the warrior operating in this explosive power is what the text repeatedly refers to as the blood of Jesus.
In this theological framework, the blood shed on the cross is not viewed merely as a historical event to be remembered on Easter. It is an active, present, and totally impenetrable spiritual covering.
It's their armor.
It is the literal lifeblood of the SWAT-Warrior. The text asserts that there is more absolute power in one single drop of that blood than in the entire combined kingdom of Satan. It is the indisputable legal and spiritual authority that protects the warrior from the devourer and guarantees the ultimate victory of the mission.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize this incredibly intense journey we have just been on. We have explored Ryan Engelbrecht's sweeping vision of believers stepping out of the pews and enlisting as a spiritually mature, highly accountable SWAT team.
We have mapped out a terrifying, multidimensional battlefield that spans the cosmos across the realms of land, sea, and air.
Yet ultimately zeroes in on the microscopic territory of the human mind, heart, and will. We have seen the absolute necessity of cultivating Caleb's bravery to enter the fight, Peter and John's toughness to endure the cultural beatings, and the audacious zeal of Shadrach to relentlessly pursue the mission.
And that mission is nothing less than sozo total, holistic healing and deliverance for a broken world, tearing down the kingdom of darkness piece by piece.
When you look at the totality of this architecture, it completely reframes the human experience. If we adopt this lens, even just as a thought experiment, it removes the mundane from our lives. It suggests that nothing is purely an accident, and no human interaction is spiritually neutral.
Which raises a fascinating question for you to ponder as you go about the rest of your week.
Oh, what's that?
We've talked extensively about the individual engaging in this warfare, but what happens to the spiritual ecosystem of an entire community when a critical mass of individuals actually adopt this SWAT mindset?
Oh, wow.
If the enemy relies on these strongholds in the land, sea, and air to blanket a city in fear, apathy, or division, what happens to the literal atmospheric pressure of a town when hundreds of believers begin systematically racing those strongholds?
That's incredible to think about.
Does the spiritual vacuum created by that much deliverance fundamentally alter the culture, the crime rates, the very nature of a geographic location? And if so, what is our personal responsibility to the city we live in?
It takes the concept of community service to a completely cosmic level. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some truly intense, thought-provoking, and paradigm-shifting source material. Stay curious, keep exploring the hidden architecture of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.